Welcome to a new wave of entrepreneurship. I'm Latifa Farah, the Associate Creative Producer at Venture for Canada and the producer of A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. Venture for Canada is a national charity on a mission to foster the entrepreneurial skills and mindsets of young Canadians. Our vision is a Canada where young people can equitably realize their entrepreneurial potential to build the most prosperous place in the world. The focus of this podcast is to hear from changemakers and Canadian entrepreneurs and to learn about how they've developed their entrepreneurial mindset and skills. In Season 8, we'll be chatting with CEOs, founders, and successful business leaders about their career journeys. In this episode, we're joined by John Baird, a senior advisor at Bennett Jones LLP and a former senior cabinet minister in the Government of Canada. An instrumental figure in bilateral trade and investment relationships, Mr. Baird has played a leading role in the Canada-China dialogue and worked to build the ties with the ASEAN countries. In addition, Mr. Baird has worked closely with international leaders to strengthen security and economic ties with the United States and the Middle Eastern countries. John Baird sits down with Scott to discuss how to deal with geopolitical risks.
I am so thrilled to have the Honorable John Baird on Venture for Canada's podcast, A New Wave of Entrepreneurship, this afternoon. You have an expertise on so many different topics, one of which is geopolitical risk. First off, for our audience, can you define what is geopolitical risk?
I think it's a public policy challenge that we face, that entrepreneurs and companies face globally, whether that's economic risk, trade risk, technical risk, the risk of on international peace and security, disrupted supply chains. Even before the global pandemic, Fortune 500 CEOs were calling geopolitical risk a top 5 concern for them, and it's obviously gotten demonstrably higher than it was 3 years ago.
What are some of the main ways that geopolitical risk can be measured?
I don't think it's more subjective. It's not really. It's more of an art than a science. I think you just see, if you're operating an energy company in Ukraine, obviously your operations have been dramatically curtailed. If you're looking at opening a mine in a foreign country, obviously the regulatory risk is huge. If you're a company that depends on free trade and the movement of goods and services around the world, that's obviously was affected in a major way by the pandemic. If you're operating an airline, you can no longer fly over Russia. So Toronto, for a Canadian airline, Toronto to Beijing or Toronto to Hong Kong just doesn't cut it. You have to go through Vancouver now because the planes aren't big enough to have gas tanks to make it in one flight. So geopolitical risk is everywhere for business people.
If someone is a CEO of a company or they're on a board of a company and they're thinking about geopolitical risks that could impact their company, that could potentially put them out of business or severely disrupt their business operations, who are folks that they can go to for advice on geopolitical risks? Is it something that they do in-house, or is it something around engaging external third parties?
Well, they can engage external third-party counsel to advise them. They can, bring in that to their board or to their executive suite. They can, I serve as a senior advisor to the Eurasia Group, which is the world's largest geopolitical risk consultancy. So people need counsel because it matters and it's tremendously important.
What do you feel are some of the common misconceptions that people make when thinking about geopolitical risk?
I think people can be naive to think that when governments make commitments to them abroad, that they'll honor those commitments. So when they're making capital investments in a foreign country, they've got to understand the challenge and the risk that they're taking. Obviously, it's a lot safer when you have a strong rule of law in a Western economy. But even in Western economies, the Canada Pension Plan wanted to acquire the airport in Auckland, New Zealand, and the country said no. There was a large investment in a pipeline in Norway, and they changed the rules after the acquisition happened. So even an Australian potash company wanted to make a major investment in Canada, and the government denied it. So it's not just in risky third world countries or in far-flung places without the rule of law. It can even be the case with some of our closest friends and allies.
To the point about the importance of the rule of law, do you think that that's partially what can make Canada an attractive place for people to invest? Or do you think that Canada, that we have a perception as a country that we have this amazing rule of law that maybe isn't as strong as we perceive it to be?
I mean, I think it's probably stronger in Canada than in about 98% of countries of the world. At the same time, it can be awfully difficult to get regulatory approval for something in the extractive sector, in energy or mining. It can take a prolonged period of time for decisions to be granted, whether you're talking about a pipeline or a mine. So I think people need to go into it with both eyes wide open. And capital, I think I thought I understood this when I was in government, but capital can move very quickly. If the investment environment isn't as good in British Columbia, but it's better in Alberta, that's where the capital will flow. If Southern United States is a better destination for investment than in Ontario, that's where it'll go. And governments have to be mindful of that, particularly when you shouldn't change the rules in the middle of the game. You can change the rules going forward, but it's awfully tough to do when you do it retrospectively or retroactively.
What do you think are some of the key things that Canada or provincial governments can do to make the country in general more attractive to foreign direct investment?
I think just being straightforward and honest and upfront. If you're not interested in foreign investment in mining or oil and gas, say so. But don't try to invite investment in and then burden it with an 8-year process to get a project approved. It's just contradictory. I think as well, governments making decision that they want investment is important, and then what can they do to ensure that it can take place, that it's an attractive place, and you can honor the commitments that you made to them. I'd much rather have a simple regulatory approval process that would say no to a project in 8 months than a long drawn out process that would take 8 years and put 300 conditions on a project that make it economically unlikely to proceed.
One topic that seems like it's frequently discussed in Canada is the extent to which the courts have become the arbitrators of conflicts, particularly as it relates to natural resources production. Do you feel that this is an example of where sometimes the regulatory uncertainty in Canada can stymie and limit direct investment, particularly in the natural resources sector?
I think that can be a good thing and a bad thing. Hopefully, it's more of a good thing, where if the government isn't treating you fairly and isn't upholding its laws and regulations, that you have independent redress. I think that's generally speaking a good thing. But I think the proliferation of actors who have no standing in the project has had a negative and detrimental effect.
Relatedly, what do you think are some of the biggest geopolitical risks that are in particular facing Canada?
I think honoring the free trade agreements and the foreign investment protection and promotion agreements that Canada has with the world. When they come under threat, that's a huge challenge. When Donald Trump was elected, the Trudeau government was faced with an enormous challenge with his threat to tear up NAFTA. And here was a party which hadn't been supportive of free trade, particularly the Canada-U.S. free trade agreement, let alone NAFTA. But they stepped up and responded to the challenge, and I think for the first 18 months did a pretty darn good job on it, and good on them.
Moving forward, even in the context of the Biden administration, which has a focus also on Buy American and potentially certain protectionist policies, how can Canada mitigate the risk of potentially more protectionism by the United States as we think about our global trade strategy?
I think we've constantly got to be ambitious about our goals with the relationship. When we're ambitious, we get things done. I think of Brian Mulroney with the NAFTA deal. I think of his leadership with respect to the acid rain treaty. He was ambitious. So, the acid rain treaty, it took him the better part of 8 years to get done. He put a lot of political capital on the line. The Harper government was able to do a lot of initiatives on the thickening of the border, got the process successfully on track to get the new Detroit River International Crossing built, the regulatory cooperation council, harmonizing some of the trade rules, which was very helpful. So I think Trudeau has actually done a better job with Trump than he has with Biden. The two leaders clearly like each other and get along well. Biden is making a visit to Canada later this month. And I just hope that the government is more ambitious in what they want to accomplish in the relationship, whether it's resolving softwood lumber, whether it's ensuring that we continue to have open borders, whether it's we can deal with some of the bilateral irritants. I think when you focus and be more ambitious, you're going to accomplish more.
How would you describe the Trudeau government's approach to the Trump administration, in particular as related to NAFTA or a renegotiation, and why do you think it was ultimately successful in your telling?
The government was, a lot of people doubted their efforts. The day after Trump was elected, and clearly they were expecting Hillary to win. The day after the government was elected, the political appointee ambassador in Washington, David McNaughton, he was a political appointment, was chair of Trudeau's campaign, brilliant appointment, very smart guy, very capable, had access to the prime minister. David McNaughton went immediately out and said, we were prepared to renegotiate NAFTA. Well, the business community was aghast. So why would we do that? Well, tell me, they were gonna do it anyways. We might as well try to get ahead of things. That was a great decision. I think as well, appointing one minister responsible for the United States file, politically and trade-wise, was a good decision, and that was Chrystia Freeland. When the prime minister went down to Washington, a week before he went down, he had the president of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in his office. That was smart. When he went down, he refused to pile on the critics of Trump when he was standing next to Trump in the East Room during a press conference. He didn't meet with a bunch of crazy left-wing progressive types. He met with the Speaker of the House of Representatives, who was a Republican. He met with the Senate Majority Leader, which was a Republican. So it was very smart in the way they executed it.
You are one of the longest-serving Canadian foreign ministers in the post-war period. You served, I think, close to five or 6 years as the foreign minister. 4 years, but still one of the longest-serving foreign ministers. Can you describe, related to your point about Ambassador McNaughton, what is the relationship between a foreign minister and ambassadors, and how can a foreign minister work with an ambassador when there is like a particularly thorny issue? Like, let's say, for instance, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the Canadian ambassador to Ukraine becomes a particularly important person. What's the relationship like between a foreign minister and an ambassador in that kind of situation?
I mean, obviously, you're not in the same country, so it's somewhat challenged. I think when we had a relationship that was a priority, I would have a much better and closer relationship with our man or woman on the ground. I think of China. We had some excellent ambassadors to China when I was in government, so I established a very good, effective relationship with them. Our ambassador in Washington is obviously one of the key appointments in the federal government, and that relationship is, personal relationship is tremendously important. For ambassadors to be successful on the ground, they have to know that they have political access back home. In the case of the United States, our ambassador to the United States, their relationship with the prime minister is very important. Their relationship with the minister, I think, obviously not as important, but important as well. So I think that's good. And also, though, for longevity for foreign ministers, you want to have good personal relationships with your counterparts. I had a great relationship with Hillary Clinton. I had a good relationship with John Kerry as well. And when I picked up the phone to call Hillary, she would call back, and if we had a problem or an irritant, we could try to resolve it as expeditiously as we could. But you have to build up a relationship, and you have to build up some trust there. I can remember we had 2 Canadians detained in Egypt, and I was at the UN, and my Egyptian counterpart was there. I had dinner with them, and we were able to resolve the issue over dinner. And that doesn't happen unless you have a relationship.
So to your point about the importance of relationship building, particularly in the context of diplomatic brokering, what are some of the ways that a foreign minister or senior diplomat can build really positive relationships with counterparts?
I think it's first getting to know each other on a personal level. And that means, spending some social time together over a meal. We had one foreign minister who came. I took him to the Calgary Stampede. I took another minister horse sledding outside of Ottawa. Conversely, I went to to Boston, and John Kerry took me to a hockey game. So that those, when you can have a personal relationship, and you build that up socially, I think it's tremendously important. And often on the sidelines of a summit or international conference, you have the time to do that. I can remember Hillary Clinton hosted the G8 foreign ministers in Washington and had us over to her own home for dinner. I've seen Chrystia Freeland do that a number of times. She lives around the corner from me when she was foreign minister. So things like that.
It often seems within the North American context, a lot of focus in Canada is placed on our relationship with the United States, but Mexico is often kind of the forgotten cousin. There were some recent articles about that when there was the Three Amigos conference in Mexico City, I think in January. What do you think are some of the opportunities for enhanced bilateral ties between Mexico and Canada?
I used to have real problems with the Three Amigos type process because I didn't want our relationship with the United States to be always put through that lens of the trilateral efforts. I think it's almost come the other way, is that we want a growing and a closer relationship with Mexico because it's a country that is two or three times larger than us in population or more. Its economy will in our lifetimes be bigger than Canada's, its economy. So I think Mexico is where the future is one of the places where the future is, with one caveat. Obviously, the security situation with the cartels and violence in some parts of Mexico are a real concern, but let's hope it's a passing trend. Mexico, I think, matters and should be a greater priority for Canadian foreign policy, frankly, with both parties.
Yeah, agreed. There's so much potential within Mexico. It's a beautiful place that also has huge structural challenges, but also so much opportunity.
And with the acquisition by Canadian Pacific of Kansas City Southern, and the decision recently to allow them to integrate in 30 days, it's the opportunities are really remarkable to get Canadian potash down to Gulf Coast ports or Mexican ports for shipment to South America. It's the ability to eliminate congestion on our western ports by going to some underutilized ports like the Port of Lazar in Mexico, getting auto parts at a lower rate to Canadian manufacturing facilities and American automobile manufacturing facilities. The potential is huge. Even environmentally, to get trucks off the road, we'll be able to bring a lot more produce and stuff by rail now because of the efficiencies of having just one operator from start to finish.
Yeah, it will be interesting, particularly in the context of the auto sector, the extent to which the supply chain between the three countries can continue to grow. It's to acknowledge that there already is an extensive supply chain between the three places that is huge. And I think that often a lot of Canadians don't appreciate. For instance, Magna International is like a huge employer in Mexico and has huge kind of operations. But it'll be interesting to see.
And those components are needed in Brampton, in St. Catharines, in Oshawa. Definitely. So the greater integration of transport can be really effective.
And I think this is a great way to tie back to the theme of geopolitical risk, that essentially there are so many business opportunities related to operating internationally, building complex supply chain. But with that, there can come huge risks. Somebody can build a large auto parts manufacturer in Mexico, but if there's political instability, all of a sudden you have to recalibrate potentially.
Well, people were really concerned when Obrador was elected president. He's a socialist, and what effect would that have on the business community? By and large, many of those concerns have fortunately not happened, and the relationship has remained strong, which is fantastic.
Agreed. So for business leaders or young people who are thinking about the importance of geopolitical risks, what advice would you give a young person in terms of how they can increase their knowledge of geopolitical risks, increase their knowledge of the world, given the importance of having some basic kind of understanding of geopolitical risk will have on making important decisions potentially later on in their career?
Well, I think the challenge is for entrepreneurs and business people in Canada is that the United States is so close. It speaks the same language. It has very similar business practices, similar regulatory regimes. So it's so easy to rely on the United States for exports. But I think entrepreneurs have got to be much more ambitious. How can they reach farther for their customers, whether it's in goods and services, whether it's we have probably one of the best web of trade agreements of any country in the world. We have a free trade agreement with the European Union. We have an acting free trade agreement with the United Kingdom. We're a member of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We've got NAFTA. We've got a free trade deal with all four of the Pacific Alliance countries in Central America and South America. We've got a free trade agreement with Korea. So we're really blessed with the trade agreements we have, and we should. I always am anxious to be more ambitious to promote Canadian entrepreneurs and businesses to try to exploit and take advantage of that. But obviously, that requires people doing their homework. On these issues.
It is more important than ever for Canadian entrepreneurs and businesses to think globally and not just within the context of our country. One topic that is being discussed more is around competition policy in Canada and the extent to which potentially oligopolistic tendencies in many key sectors limits competition, that large Canadian companies can, in essence, generate significant profits through the Canadian market through being relatively protected, and that hinders big companies from looking outside of our borders. Do you think that is true? Do you agree with that argument?
Yeah, I think in many areas we're far too protectionist, and in many areas you got to be very mindful of competition policy. That's why getting good counsel when you're ever dealing with competition-related issues is really imperative. They can really cause problems. I look at like our telecommunications sector is very protected and regulated. I love competition. I think competition brings out the best in people, and it incentivizes people to do better.
To your earlier point about the geopolitical risks that can impact companies around the world, that in essence, governments can renege on commitments, and that's not just in a developing world context. That can be in contexts such as Norway or in countries that have a very established rule of law. What are ways that CEOs or business leaders can mitigate these risks that could potentially come out of thin air or be relatively low risk probabilities?
Well, low risk can lead to limited return. So I like diversifying your customer base is obviously one way to do it. If you're marketing canola globally, don't count on all of it going to China. There may be some years when the bulk of it does, but obviously canola farmers have had a huge challenge in recent years with access to the Chinese market. Pork producers had it for a while, but then were quickly let back in. So it's don't put all your eggs in one basket.
One question I have is, how do you keep abreast of what are the main things that you read? What are some of the main ways that you keep abreast of different geopolitical topics?
I think obviously The Economist is a great way of doing that, but I just think your network of friends and contacts are incredibly important. My work with the Eurasia Group, we have a group of phenomenal analysts that analyze about 85% of the global GDP. So keeping those relationships up. Someone like an Ian Bremmer is a brilliant analyst of geopolitical risk. So he's someone I look to, but also personal relationships. I got together with the Prime Minister of Israel last month. I was in Dubai where I met with one of the ministers this week. I spent some time with the former Australian Prime Minister last week. So good personal relationships, good personal conducts are invaluable.
I recently read a book by Henry Kissinger, which is amazing that he published this book at like almost 100. It's probably the last book he publishes in his life, but who knows? He might publish another one at like 102. And that was one of the things that I gained appreciation was even like in his 40, 50 years of retirement, the extent to which he kept up and maintained those relationships that he established when he was Secretary of State, which makes me think a little bit about some of the experiences that you just described. One person.
He's probably the wisest foreign policy analyst in the world. He is widely regarded as one of the best diplomatic leaders in the modern era. I've got to know him, met him many times, whether at his office, at his home in New York, or over a meal. He is still an incredibly sharp mind. particularly on some of the areas where we're having big challenges today, like China and like Russia. And I think he always has something thoughtful to say. He can still give a rattle to some when he makes his comments. But his comments are very wise and should at least be listened to. You don't have to act on them, but you should just be mindful of them.
What are some of the key lessons that you've learned from Henry Kissinger?
I think his recent comments, for example, on Russia and on Putin, that there's a lot of value to them. It is not impossible to think that the Russians could use a nuclear weapon. And if the West or Ukraine tries to humiliate him at the end of a conflict, there could be a catastrophic price to pay. The conflict could go on. That could lead to millions more being displaced, hundreds of thousands of more people being killed. So is to keep in mind the value of peace and bringing an end to the conflict. His work on China, I mean, he was so visionary on building relationships with China back in the early 70s. Canada actually had full diplomatic relations before he went to Peking, but I think that was tremendously wise. Unfortunately, the relationship in the last 5 or 10 years has begun to unravel, which I think is a very negative thing for international peace security. And so many young people don't remember the realities of the Cold War, where you actually worried about a nuclear weapon being deployed, where literally trillions of dollars had to be spent in arms. There was a nuclear arms race. There was a conventional arms race. There were many proxy wars, hot wars, whether they were in Afghanistan, whether they were in Vietnam, that millions of people were killed. So I think Dr. Kissinger is a very wise man in the field of foreign policy, and like I said, he's still as sharp as ever intellectually, which is a remarkable accomplishment.
Oh, completely. A role model of aging for many folks. And when you think of everything that he's been through, fighting World War II, escaping from Germany as a child, and the Holocaust, his life is been pretty remarkable. I recommend to listeners, if anyone's interested in learning more about Henry Kissinger, to read Niall Ferguson's great two-part biography, and it gives appreciation of just how remarkable his life has been.
I was at a dinner once with Dr. Kissinger and his brother, who I think is 3 years younger than him, and his brother has no German accent whatsoever, which made me laugh.
Yeah, it's funny about how accents, like, sometimes they stick and then sometimes they go away. One person you mentioned also earlier in the conversation was Ian Bremmer, who I think is a fascinating thinker. And as a reminder to our listeners, he's the founder and I believe CEO of the Eurasia Group, which is one of the leading, if not the leading, geopolitical risk consulting firm in the world. What are some of the things that you've learned from Ian Bremmer over the years?
Just the state of play on a hotspot. He has an incredible network, and he'll make an observation. I say, well, why would you say that? He said, well, I actually had coffee with the vice president of the European Union last week, or I spoke to our ambassador in Egypt last week. So he just has an incredible network, and his team at the Eurasia Group are incredible. They'll know. He's got people all over the world that have incredible networks in the country they analyze for, and can provide great advice and counsel to clients, and frankly to governments as well.
One thing I'm amazed at Ian Bremmer, and I asked the question if Ian Bremmer sleeps, because that guy seems like he has literally working around the clock. How does someone like Ian Bremmer manage to have so many of the different conversations and write books and do all of those different things at the same time? I've always been perplexed because the amount of things that first guy does is
his time is very well managed by his team, very well managed.
Yeah, a very impressive guy, and I look forward to reading his new book. Shifting back to China a little bit, and Henry Kissinger. Even in ancient Greece, there was the concept of the Thistocles trap, which I think I'm mispronouncing, which is in essence that you have, when there's a rising power and there's a stagnating or decreasing power, that there is bound to be a conflict. And a lot of people have extrapolated that to the current situation between China and the United States. What are some of the ways that leaders can mitigate the potential for the next for a Cold War between China and the United States?
I think first I say is, as Wayne Gretzky used to practice, go where the puck is going, not where it is now. And the United States, Dr. Kissinger, and frankly even Pierre Trudeau, forged ties with China in the early '70s, which was incredibly brilliant to effectively establish relationships and nurture them for decades. Obviously long before China was an economic power. It was obviously had a huge population. That's tremendously important, and I worry. It also means diplomatic engagement, and people say, "Well, I can't work with that country." Well, someone said, "Oh, China, they shouldn't be hosting the Olympics. They don't have the right values." And I said, "Well, there's only about 38 countries in the world which you could say generally share our values, but there's 193 countries represented at the UN. So you have to deal with people you agree with and people you disagree with. Now, there'll be some odd exceptions for that. For example, I think Iran, with its material support for terrorism, the fact that it's killed dozens and dozens of Canadians, its nuclear program, its support for terrorism around the world, its meddling in every country in the region. But we need to work with countries who we don't always agree with. I would say, China's an example of that. Frankly, India we don't always agree with, but they're obviously an important relationship for Canada.
I believe Henry Kissinger was once quoted as saying is that in international relations, there are no friends and enemies, there are only interests. What are your thoughts on that quotation?
Totally agree. And one of the challenges that the power in the world's become so much more diffuse than it was even when I was born. That we need to nurture relationships elsewhere. We can no longer count Canada, whether it's conservative or liberal governments. We can no longer count on the United States being a solid friend and ally of the United States. So, there was a time when Brian Mulroney could pick up the phone and get the president on the line and solve a problem. That's becoming increasingly harder to do. So that's why it's important that we've got to diversify our relationships, and that's why we have to have a relationship with China. We should have strong relationships as we do with the Sunni Arab states in the Middle East, and that's not affected by our strong support of Israel, as we've seen with the Abraham Accords. I think when you engage, I can recall the last meeting I had with the man who's now the king of Saudi Arabia. I had a whole bunch of human rights issues I wanted to raise, and as I entered his office, I thought if I raise like 8 issues with him, he's not going to remember. On the human rights side, he's not going to remember any of them. So we had a long conversation for 15 or 20 minutes about the role of women in Saudi society. And he explained that half would agree and half would be strongly against it, and the constraints that he had. And as a friend, I think I could say, like, I think you have more room, Your Majesty, to go farther. You have a greater capacity to provide leadership, and Canada wants to be there to support you and to help you. I met with the head of their Human Rights Commission, and what's the state of play today is not perfect, but it's demonstrably better than it was 10 years ago. Saudi says they're bringing the full emancipation of women. Their ambassador to Washington's a woman. They've opening up Saudi society, which we should all welcome and cheer the progress they've made, and then encourage them to keep going.
Agreed. The progress on women's rights in Saudi Arabia over the last 5 to 10 years is incredibly impressive. And it's interesting because something I feel that most people aren't necessarily that aware of, that 10 years ago, I believe it was like women in Saudi Arabia largely couldn't drive or leave a home without a man.
Yeah. I was at a dinner in Abu Dhabi, and I met a woman who's chairman of a large Saudi bank. She said that would have been unimaginable 5 or 10 years ago.
Yeah, there's been a sea change.
And it's not perfect, but boy, oh boy, it's going in the right direction. My last visit to the kingdom, I even said to a friend of mine who's one of the princes, I said, are they going too fast? Is there a concern this could all snap back because the government's been too ambitious? And he said, no, he didn't think so, and he was right.
Yeah, it's very interesting how Saudi Arabia has changed, and the influence of Mohammed bin Salman and the new Saudi leadership and the generational shift from his grandfather has been quite significant.
I give huge credit to the new president of the United Arab Emirates when he was crown prince, and still today was a real mentor to the crown prince in Riyadh on reform and opening up. And the UAE is, by all means, not perfect. It makes many mistakes, but it's probably one of the best governed countries in the world. I was in Dubai this week, and I met they actually have a cabinet minister who's a member of the royal family, who's the minister of tolerance. They actually have a minister of tolerance to work within Emirati society and with their foreign policy to support pluralism and respect. Last time I was in Abu Dhabi, I went to the Abraham Center, where the government's actually assisted in building. There's one property where they've got a mosque, a synagogue, and a church to promote religious pluralism. It's really remarkable. So the UAE leadership has really been inspiring to I think the government of Saudi Arabia, but also just their example. I think Riyadh looks at Abu Dhabi and Dubai, and they say we want that, and that's why they're opening up the economy. They're opening up Saudi society, which is a good thing.
On the topic of leadership, you've had the opportunity in your life to interact with so many of the defining leaders of our era, from Hillary Clinton to John Kerry, Henry Kissinger, and the list goes on. Who is a leader that you particularly admire in the context of their diplomatic leadership, and that you feel sometimes goes underappreciated amongst the broader population?
I think one of the people I respect most in the world today that's alive is the Aga Khan, His Highness. He is a remarkable proponent for humanitarian causes around the world, and probably the world's leading proponent of supporting and promoting pluralism. A remarkable fellow.
Yeah, I agree. The Aga Khan is somebody who continues into his 80s, making phenomenal contributions around the world in terms
And
of.
he is like Henry Kissinger, like Queen Elizabeth, like the late Saudi foreign minister, has played at such a high level for so many decades. Even the list that I said now, I mean, obviously Queen Elizabeth II has passed. There's very few people who've played at that level for that long, and he's a very, very wise man. When I was foreign minister, he was, someone that I could get candid, private, confidential advice from, which was the value, which was immeasurable.
And he is a great friend to Canada, one of the few people.
Oh, absolutely. He is actually an honorary Canadian citizen, but he actually, in many ways represents the best of Canada.
Agreed. And he has huge ties to Canada in so many different ways. At Venture for Canada, there's even a little bit of a ties to the Aga Khan. One of our board directors is on the board of the Aga Khan Museum, and has gotten to know some of the members of Aga Khan family quite well. And he's an Ismaili Muslim himself.
Yeah, I've met His Highness many times, and I was at an international summit on forum, a summit on Afghanistan, and he was attending, and he sent word to invite me to lunch, and we had a great conversation over lunch, and I actually thought in my mind, wow, I'm becoming friends with the Aga Khan. And as I thought that in my mind, he looked at me and extended his hand. John, consider me a friend. And I really got a almost spiritual connection. And he's very humble about his religious leadership too.
What are some of the ways that you think the Aga Khan can bridge the gaps between different parts of the world and be a bridge for pluralism?
I think his humanitarian efforts are probably number one, but the influence that he would have in many parts of the world where others don't, like in Central Asia, not a lot of Westerners have the capacity for leadership that he does. It's incredible. The Ismailis also play leadership roles in so many countries, which is pursuing his vision especially.
And in Canada.
For example, you look in Canada, there are so many foreign aid groups who get like 95% of their funding from the government of Canada. When we work with the Aga Khan Foundation on international development efforts, they bring money to the table themselves that they've raised here in Canada to the table in efforts around the world. And when a foreign aid group, a humanitarian group, has some skin in the game, inevitably the results are impressive.
Close off the conversation on geopolitical risk, and thinking of our audience, which are predominantly young Canadians, and as they go forward in their careers, What's some tangible advice that you would give a young Canadian starting their career in terms of how they can think about geopolitical risk and how they can educate themselves moving forward on these important topics?
Well, first thing is be ambitious. Look to beyond the United States and Canada for new markets. Think big, and just look before you leap. And obviously, getting an advisor or counsel can be important. But if it's a young company, often if you ask smart people in any sort of field for advice, for a young entrepreneur, they'd probably be thrilled to give their advice and their opinion. Also, read, and read to know what you're getting into. And past results dictate future results. So you look at where people have had problems, you can probably expect that to continue. Where people have had successes, that's likely to continue as well.
John, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. We've had a great conversation. Really interesting to learn a little bit more about some of your personal experiences speaking with Hillary Clinton or interacting with Henry Kissinger, and also your thoughts on some of the greatest geopolitical risks facing Canada and the world. As well as providing some really tangible pieces of advice for young Canadians as they think about their careers and preparing for that. Thank you so much for coming.
Scott, it's great to spend time with you.
That's it for this week's episode of A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. Stay connected with us via our socials and our email list. Subscribe to us in your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss our next episode. If you have feedback on today's episode, tweet us at Venture for Canada, that is Venture for Canada, or email us at podcast@ventureforcanada.ca. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening. I'm Latifa Farah, and that was Scott Stirrett. Until next time, stay safe, stay motivated, and stay grateful.